actually start with recovery mode because I think that's kind of a shorter demo. But yeah, let me introduce recovery mode. So we kind of started off with a question of like, let's say, you're running workflows and you have some sort of like broad system failure, or maybe say like a third party like plugin connection fails, or, your Flyte deployment has issues. And for whatever reason, that kind of results in like a mass like result of like system errors that end up terminating your workflows. And recovering those is pretty annoying, especially if you don't have discovery caching enabled, because you're gonna have to go through and like recompute a lot of work if you want to retrigger all of those executions. So recovery mode we introduced in order to basically help with that scenario. And the way this works is it'll allow you to kind of say recover an individual execution, and it'll copy all the successful node executions that ran previously, and then start essentially from running any of the failed nodes. So you don't have to kind of redo all of your work, even if you didn't have discovery enabled. And that's probably best visualized with the demo. So let me share my screen. Sorry, my cat's a little grumpy. So let me know if you can see my screen. And if so we can take a look here. We have like this example workflow execution. In this case, I just aborted it. We didn't have, say, a system failure necessarily, but in either case, it didn't succeed. Pretty simple workflow execution, just a couple of nodes. One succeeded, one was terminated when I ran the abort. The workflow execution is aborted overall. So if, let's say I want to recover this execution, I can go to our handy dandy Flyte CTL. Thanks, Yuvraj and Praful for that demo again. And we can just create an execution. And you'll notice in this case, we have this recover flag that we pass, and that is just the execution ID within the same project domain, SG4BKN, SG4BKN, etc. So we can go ahead and trigger a new workflow execution. We'll get this new execution identifier. Take a look at it in the console here. And you can see that this N0 is recovered immediately. So there was just like no like overhead or anything. We didn't have to start a pod again or fetch discovery values. And now we're immediately running N1, which was the failed node execution previously. You can take a look here. You can see that the inputs got passed, and it basically started off where the last execution failed. So Niels is going to go over into kind of more like, the remote, like programmatic Flyte executions stuff in the next meeting. You can imagine, you can like create like a script, basically run through like a series of, failed executions over time duration, go ahead and trigger recovery for all of them. And you can basically go and recoup kind of like your system state previous to kind of a broad like system failure. So our execution succeeded, and we are all good to go. Awesome. So that's pretty much it for recovery mode. I don't know if there's any questions on that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there going to be console support for this? This seems really nice to like just kind of trigger from the console.
For sure. Yeah. So that's forthcoming as well too. Like we'll probably add some kind of like recover button in the console as well. It just, UI support is always a struggle because but that'll happen eventually.
Cool, thanks. This is really neat.
Any other questions? Cool, okay. If not, we can go into reactive workflow events. So let me go ahead and present this. And I think I'm using the same theme as Purple, so great theme. So reactive workflow events. So before we go into what reactive workflow events are, let's talk a little bit about the state of how to trigger workflow executions today. So traditionally, you can go into the console, launch an execution, launch one from Flyte CTL or even, Flyte CLI before, but they always kind of require like a human in the loop, right? And so, there are ways to kind of like programmatically trigger executions, but you have to go ahead and kind of like manually like initiate that create execution request. We do have scheduled workflows, which is kind of like a departure from that model, right? Where you have these kind of events that trigger workflow executions on a regular schedule, but we don't kind of like really extrapolate that model to anything else. So for the most part, you kind of have to go and manually trigger an execution. So this is where reactive workloads come in. In a lot of scenarios, especially in kind of like, ETL, like data, like training or data, like processing jobs or machine learning, like data training jobs, you kind of want to like trigger an execution once something like, upstream has happened, some event that you're listening to, and then you go ahead and use the outputs of that event in order to launch an execution. So some examples of that are, say you have a data partition that lands upstream and then you want to go ahead and trigger some kind of processing job. maybe a different flight workflow execution terminates successfully. And in that case, you want to go ahead and use the outputs of that execution to feed into an input to a separate execution. Kind of continuing on the data partition theme, we could also have just individual file uploads, some kind of marker that some process has terminated, and you can go ahead and start a different execution. And there's tons more examples of this, different sorts of like pub sub queues on different cloud providers, say even like webhook, web applications, and custom applications like Slack or Stripe or GitHub or even more. If some event happens, in one of these applications, you want to trigger Flyte workflow execution. And what these all kind of have in common is that, you're like waiting and pulling on an external event to trigger execution, as opposed to having a human kind of sitting there and clicking like execute. So in this talk, I'll kind of go over like the user-facing proposal for like how we want to expose reactive workflow events in like say Python like SDK type environment, not so much the implementation, but I'll kind of go over that a little bit here. We're just kind of gathering feedback right now on like how to like expose this and make this usable. To kind of begin with, like we'll talk about event sources and targets, the terminology we'll be using here. So an event source is, like that kind of like upstream file landing or that upstream workflow execution terminating. So that's kind of, like this like Boolean condition that when satisfied, will go ahead and trigger that target. And in this case, the target for our kind of V1 implementation is only going to be a Flyte workflow execution. But as part of this implementation, what we want to do is integrate with Argo events. So Argo itself is actually an open source workflow orchestration engine that's kind of, I guess you could say, comparable to Flyte. But they have a fully like kind of independent like events project, which basically handles kind of, it's like Kubernetes native, and it integrates with all sorts of event sources, not just, like upstream files, but, like the applications and the pub sub queues and everything I was talking about earlier, and all sorts of different event triggers as well too. And what we want to do is build off of that for kind of like V1 implementation and just support a couple of these use cases, which includes listening to upstream workflow executions or file or directory changes, and then support targets, which in this case would just be a Flyte workflow execution. But eventually, like we'll kind of build this as like an open source thing within Flyte. But we do want to like upstream that to Argo events so that users don't necessarily have to be bound to kind of this SDK that we like define for reactive events, and they can actually use Argo events to trigger Flyte workflow executions, according to their setup. So let's go into kind of what some of these example like use cases would look like. So there's a document out there that kind of goes over this in more detail. It's kind of like in a review stage right now too. So if you have any feedback, I really encourage you to take a look at that. That should be posted in future discussions, but I can share it again after this meeting. And that kind of goes, again, it has these examples in more detail. But so let's take a look here. So this is kind of the first example we talked about, which is, let's say you have an upstream workflow execution and you want to trigger a downstream workflow after this previous workflow has run. So you can see this upstream workflow, I kind of, just added some like pseudocode here. It produces different outputs. And one of those happens to be, say, a file that we consume in this downstream workflow as an input. So this is the syntax that we have. So we have this kind of like trigger like body that kind of like captures this event target like syntax. So the event in this case is going to be a Flyte workflow execution. You can see we can just pass in the Flyte workflow definition itself. So you don't have to specify the execution. You don't even need to know necessarily the version. You just need that workflow definition. And then here in this case, you can see we can also like further filter that event so that we only trigger a downstream execution if, say, the upstream succeeded, because it won't produce a file otherwise, and that's kind of useless to us. And in the target syntax in this case, we'll have like a launch plan essentially that we'll invoke, and we have this kind of syntax for referencing the upstream event outputs. So we'll pass in that kind of like downstream input file by referencing the upstream workflow outputs. So yeah, any questions here, or we can move on to another example. Okay, move on to another example. Cool. So then we can take a look at kind of like the file change API as well too. So in this case, we have, say, a downstream workflow that just takes in an entire like, remote directory, create a launch plan, doesn't assign any inputs or anything. And then again, we have this kind of like event trigger syntax. So in this case, you can see the event changes. Now we have on directory create as opposed to Flyte workflow execution, and we pass in a prefix. So this will just watch this directory, and anytime a new like directory lands in this directory, it'll go ahead and create an invocation of this downstream workflow. In this case, you can see the syntax is slightly different, but we reference that upstream event directory and pass that in as the input. And we also have this kind of like invocations parameter, which limits us to, just say like the first time a directory lands in this prefix, then we'll go ahead and trigger an execution, but we won't watch anymore after that. On the theme of that, we can kind of customize like these events some more. So one thing we were considering adding was say timeouts. Let's say you have like this, event listener that's, like triggered for perpetuity. Maybe it doesn't really make sense for this like listener to like, live forever. So you can add an expiration time, and then we'll essentially delete this event listener after that. And then also kind of went over this earlier with like the invocations. You can also limit the number of times that an event gets triggered. If it doesn't make sense to like constantly, like pull and produce new workflow executions. Well, and then also kind of wacky stuff like multiple events. So this is, again, like Argo has support for this all under the hood. And what we'll do is we'll be basically like, taking these user event definitions and translating them into Argo like event source like objects. So they actually do have support for like multiple upstream objects. So we could also kind of build like an SDK on top of that as well too. In this case, we have a composite union event, which means once both of these conditions are triggered, then we'll go ahead and produce a workflow or invoke a workflow execution with these these upstream event outputs as inputs to the downstream workflow. Yeah, so that's kind of like an overview of the proposal. Again, this is just kind of like a user-facing proposal. We'll talk more about the implementation later. But this will, again, like build all on top of Argo. So we'll be kind of translating like the user-facing code into Argo events. And again, fully open source and like integratable. So hopefully it should add some value to the Argo ecosystem as well as the Flyte one too. Yeah, any questions?
Thanks very much for that demo, Katrina. Let's see. Any questions, comments? Oh, thank you, Niels, for dropping in the link to the document in the chat. So if you have any comments to that, please go ahead and add them. Any questions, comments, or ideas?
I have a quick question for Katrina. Is the event framework flexible enough to say trigger an event after, like say I'm ingesting data points into S3 and I want to retrain every 1,000 data points? Say I'm like using like some kind of SageMaker labeling job or something, which that does dump labeled records into S3. Would it be possible to retrain a model like on every 1,000 events or something like that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think right now the event sensors are like for the most part stateless minus the kind of like invocations count. But I think that's something we can do with like the underlying like Minio API, which would power these kind of file change events. As we get notified on any kind of like file change type that we subscribe to. So we could introduce kind of like the separate state that could maybe enable things like that, like for the customizations on top. So like every 1,000 files or whatnot. So yeah, that's something to consider. But yeah, I would have to explore like that syntax and the implementation a little bit more too.